Okay, so I'm going to start off by welcoming everybody to the first Hematology Oncology CCHCSP joint session. My name is Linda Pires, and I'm the program manager for CCHCSP. And I'm now joined by Amy Liu, one of the chief resident fellows in hematology oncology. I hope I said that right. And now I'm going to hand it over to Amy Liu to introduce our presenter for the day.
Hi, everyone. Really excited for this seminar. Just wanted to introduce Dr. Eric Benchimol, who's a professor in the Department of Pediatrics and Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. He's also a pediatric gastroenterologist at the SickKids Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center, a senior scientist at the SickKids Research Institute, and a senior core scientist at ICES. He has been associated with CCHCSP since 2006. Was first a rising researcher and then funded by a Doctoral Award, a Career Development Award, and a Career Enhancement Program from the CCHCSP. He's currently co-chair of the Curriculum Committee and co-center leader for the University of Toronto. Dr. Benchimol's research focuses on the epidemiology and outcomes of patients with inflammatory bowel disease. He chairs the Canadian Gastro-Intestinal Epidemiology Consortium, which conducts epidemiology, pharmacoepidemiology, outcomes and health services research using the health administrative data from multiple provinces. He also has an interest in improving the methods used to conduct research using routinely collected health data. In that capacity, he co-chairs the Records Steering Committee, an international group that has created reporting guidelines for observational studies that use routinely collected health data for research. Quite an impressive biography, and we're so excited to hear your pearls of wisdom on manuscript writing. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. That's an impressive introduction for a very simple topic of how to write a paper. But thank you, Amy. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen now. Make sure I'm sharing the right one. There we go. You guys should be able to see my slides now. All right. So this is a talk I've given a few times, primarily to the GI fellows, both locally at SickKids and also internationally. Our North American Society for Pediatric GI has annual symposia just for fellows. And I've given this to the second year fellows conference a couple of times, and they found it useful. So I hope you do as well. And I did develop this with Peter Church, who's one of the staff gastroenterologists as well. So the outline will really be about writing a paper and why we do it, number one, and then what's your approach to writing a paper? What's my approach to writing a paper, both before, during, and after writing the actual paper? So we all know, I think, why we write a paper in terms of academic currency, right? It is our academic currency. It's sort of the publish or perish model. If you're involved in a university or an academic department of any sort, you have to publish your research. But there are really more important reasons, I think, to publish research. Firstly, is that the idea of scientific discovery and scientific knowledge, trying to improve the health of patients, trying to develop new health policies and so on. In the end, you can do all of this work, but if it's not published, if it's not accessible and it's not readable by people who would make decisions or change or provide clinical care, it really doesn't exist. There's no purpose to doing the work if you're not publishing it, if you're not getting it out there. And so that brings to the larger question of, does it have to be published in an academic journal? And I think what we're learning about is, no, it probably doesn't, but we're in a very much transition period where the universities still want us to publish in academic journals, and that's sort of the currency. But I think there's going to be new modalities out there to publish that hopefully with time, universities will appreciate and understand. So, you know, the problem with publishing and doing research anyway, is that anywhere along this knowledge creation cycle, you can perish, right? You can drop out before you have an idea, which is unusual. A lot of us have good ideas if we're here. You can drop out between idea and actually doing the research, writing the paper, and then publishing the paper. And so my goal today is really to make sure that you don't drop out at this stage or at this stage. So again, the scientific principles and why we publish is that research has to be reproducible. If you repeat it in an experiment over and over and over again, you should get similar results. It should be replicatable, meaning that if other people are repeating your research over and over again, they should get similar results if they have the access to the same materials and methods. And it should be transparent. So the research that you're actually conducting should be well reported and very clear, and so that the reader can understand and appreciate the strengths and weaknesses of the paper. And often we don't do this very well. We don't produce research that's transparent in our papers, and we don't present enough scientific data so the reader can fully evaluate the quality of the information. So we really need to do a better job at producing research, producing publications that not only assess reliability and relevance, but allow the reader to do the same. So let's talk about some tips before, during, and after writing. Procrastination, sort of the bane, I think, of everybody's existence potentially. And really, there's useful procrastination and there's not useful procrastination. Useful procrastination meaning don't do things that don't need to be done right now, that you can procrastinate to a time that's better and more productive to do. Not useful procrastination is you can't sit down and actually write the paper. And unfortunately, I think procrastination is a big problem with a lot of people, especially at the more student stage, that it's very hard for some people to sit down and actually write. So you need an approach to what you're going to do in your career in terms of writing and research and your scientific advancement in order to avoid this procrastination. And I find that the number one tip that people need to sit down and do with themselves or with a mentor is sitting down and establishing your goals. So that means short, medium, and long-term goals and making them smart, right? Making them specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. And if you do that, if you decide, I want to finish this project by this date, and I want to write a grant so that in 1 to 3 years, I'll have some funding for my next project. And in 5 years, I want to get promoted to associate professor, or I want to get a job as faculty. I think you're much more likely to do the actions that are required to achieve those goals, right? So the first thing you need to do, though, is write down those goals, verbalize those goals, and make sure that you know in your own mind what you want to achieve. And then the second, once you have those goals, the second thought is, you need to decide whether or not you do something, right? So you're going to be offered a lot of things, and you need to think about the Pareto principle every time. The Pareto principle states that 80% of your productivity, 80% of your output is going to be garnered by 20% of your efforts. So you really need to focus on that 20%, that's going to be most useful to get that 80% output in the end. And to do that, you need to say no, and you're going to need to say no to a lot of things. You may feel right now as students, you're looking for every opportunity. You don't want to say no to anything. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do as a student or a fellow. But as you become junior faculty, as you get staff jobs, as you go out into practice, there's going to be a lot of offers coming your way, a lot of opportunities. And you need to keep focused on your goals and objectives and say no to the things that don't fit with your overall vision for yourself. I think that's extremely important. Otherwise, you're going to get overwhelmed and you're not going to put in the effort you need to do everything that needs to be done. And particularly, you're not going to have the time to sit down and write. And I'll come back to this idea of time to write, because if you don't have time to write, nothing is going to get written, right? It doesn't matter how good a writer you are. It doesn't matter how good the science is. It's just not going to get done. So tip number 3 is really to do your homework as an adult. And that doesn't mean going to Netflix. It doesn't mean watching movies. It doesn't mean surfing social media. It means really reading and reading a lot. And you need to be aware of the scientific field that you're in. If you're going to embark on research, before you start writing, you need to know what's out there and you need to know how to write. What are people looking for in a publication? Well, as you're reading, you should really be using a citation manager to manage your references, so that when you go and start writing, the references are all there and easily at hand, right? So citation managers are like EndNote, RefWorks, Mendeley, Papers, there's others. I use EndNote. And then before you want to start writing, do your homework in terms of outline your paper, right? Like, what do you want to say when you're writing? What's the message of your paper? And in your discussion, what exactly is each paragraph going to say? So let's go back to this idea of time to write. And I think that the bottom line is everybody's calendars are busy. And unless you block time in your calendar to write, you're not going to be successful in writing. It's just not going to happen. And so you need time in your calendar for writing and also to think, to teach, and to review. So I'm going to give you an example of my calendar this week. And this is what my calendar looks like. So you see that every Monday morning, and well, you don't see it because you only see one Monday morning, but every single Monday morning, I have a weekly review of trying to establish what my goals are for that week. And I know what my most important tasks are for that week, and I make sure that I do them, or I get them done by the end of the week at some point. And often writing is a major, most important task that I have to do. I also block usually 2 3 to 4 hour blocks every week Tuesday afternoons are completely blocked off every week. And then once, 2 weeks earlier, I will find another 3 to 4 hour block to block off, and DW stands for deep work. And deep work for me means, it's based on the Cal Newport book, Deep Work, where it means really you're doing the work, the high intensity, high brain power work that you're paid to do, your currency. And for the most part for us, that means writing papers and writing grants, right? That's what we are paid to do at this stage. And that's what we need to get out there. So if you block off that time in your calendar, and it might not be as much time as I have, you may have one project that there is not that much writing to do, but you will have time to think, you will have time to edit, you will have time to look over your results. If you block off that time in your calendar, you're much more likely to stick with that regular routine of doing it every single week. So tip number 5 is really determining authorship order and who's going to be called an author before you start writing. And I think this is an agreement that you need to make with your co-investigators before you start writing, and your supervisors if you're students, in order to make sure that you don't offend anybody and that it's completely clear who's going to be an author and in what order. So I'm happy to distribute these slides, by the way. I can send them to Linda and she can mail them around, but there'll be links in the slides. Really what you need to read carefully is the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors and their guidelines for what is an author, what contribution is enough to be an author. And it really is these things, right? Designing a project, collecting or analyzing data, drafting and revising the manuscript, and approval of the final manuscript. I tend to be very, very generous with authorship. I don't think there's a reason to limit authorship, to only 5 people or 10 people or whatever it is. I think if you've contributed in any way, and that might mean just collecting data, that might mean organizing a project, like my research coordinators are all authors on my papers, analysts, even though they're paid, I make them authors. You really want to, be generous with that authorship, I think, because in the end, it'll come back to bite you if you're not. And, I think it'll come back to benefit you if you are generous with authorship. In terms of authorship orders, you probably all are aware of this, but just in case you're not, the first author is usually the person who writes the paper, who actually sits down and writes. And so that's usually a junior investigator, a student, the person who, sits down and actually does the work of writing and synthesizing the data and putting it into words. I still like to write papers, so I'm still first author here and there on papers, even though I've got a team and students and things like that. The last author is typically a supervisor, right? So the person who's senior on the paper, who's helped you along with the paper and so on. And I think that's important because it's important to remember as a student or an assistant professor, people are expecting you to be first author, not as much last author. As you become more senior, people are not expecting you to be first author. They want you to supervise students and build capacity and so on. So they want you to be last author. Middle authors are people who contributed scientifically and typically in order of decreasing importance. So, a second author has contributed more than a third author and so on. That being said, it's often not so easy to distinguish who contributes more, and sometimes you want to go alphabetical or whatever. I do tend to consider the position of paid contributors, so I make them authors. So for example, my analysts at ICES, they all contribute scientifically. There's no doubt about it. They know their stuff, they know how to code, they know the weaknesses of the analysis and so on. So I always make them an author. However, if they've done some analysis and haven't contributed a huge amount, I won't make them as high an author as, an investigator, an academic who's, done some analysis and not contributed a high amount, simply because the analysts are being paid to do the work, right? That's their job, whereas the academics need it for their currency. So you kind of have to think about that when you're deciding on authorships. And then, co-first author, co-last author, I think are increasingly being recognized by universities. 10 years ago, I think universities probably disregarded that idea of co-first or co-last. And now I think it's much more important and much more recognized as an important option. But make sure that you're actually contributing equally if you're listed as co-first, or that the co-last author is actually contributing equally and that there's not a differential there. So tip number 6 is choosing your journal, right? So you have to choose your journal wisely. And I think that the first thing you need to ask yourself in choosing your journal is, what's the audience? So who is going to read this paper? Who do I want to read this paper, I should say, not who's going to, but who do I want to read this paper? Is it aimed at a clinician? Is it aimed more methodologic? So is it aimed more at methodologists? Is it a subspecialty paper that, a general pediatrician might not care about, and you want to publish it in a hem-onc journal, for example? Is it more of a, well, you know, what's the science behind it? Is there a scientific journal that might be more relevant? You know, is this science so good that it belongs in Nature or Science, or should it be in, you know, a lower tier scientific journal? And then you want to shape your manuscript to your audience, right? So read the papers in that journal and, you know, read about the way things are described and who they're talking to, who the voice is for, and try to shape your manuscript to fit that journal in some way. And then obviously, for better or worse, impact factor is important. If you don't know what a journal impact factor is, it's a measure of, you know, it's a score derived to try to measure how impactful a journal is as a whole in, you know, reaching an audience and getting citations. And so the bottom line is the impact factor for a particular year is calculated by the total number of times its articles were cited during the two preceding years over the total number of citable articles in the journal over the 2 preceding years. And there's also a 5-year impact factor and so on. There's lots of things wrong with it. It does not measure how good a paper is. So just because you publish in a high impact journal doesn't mean your article is any good, nor should it measure how good an investigator is, right? Just because your CV is full of high impact journals doesn't mean you're a good investigator and making an impact. That being said, universities, you know, and hospitals and so on do use it to measure the quality, you know, the success, I would say, of an investigator. And so unfortunately, for better or worse, you have to pay attention to it. There's lots of things wrong with impact factor as a measure, and you can read. And if you search what's wrong with journal impact factors, you'll find tons of articles on the weaknesses of using the impact factor. But the reality is it's the best thing that we have right now to measure, you know, how good a journal is. And so you should be aware of the impact factor for your journals in your field. For the most part, you guys are in hem-onc or hematology or whatever. So you need to, you know what the best journals are in your field based on impact factor. And you get the impact factor, by the way, from journal citation reports. And all of us have access to journal citation reports through University of Toronto. So if you go onto University of Toronto's database and just search journal citation reports, it'll take you to the website, and you can search for your particular field, like hematology, and it'll list the best impact factors from highest to lowest in your field. Choosing the journal also means avoiding bad journals, and bad journals, what I mean here is not low impact factor journals, it's predatory journals. So the definition of a predatory journal are journals that will publish basically anything for money, right? So you submit a fee and it gets published. And there's been lots of work to show that pretty much anything will get published, even gibberish. There's an excellent series of articles, and I wish I could remember the journalist's name, but Ottawa Citizen journalist who basically did this, right? He's had a multi-year campaign to expose predatory journals, and submitted things that were complete gibberish, or he took half of a cardiology article and half of a plant biology article and mashed it together and submitted to one of these predatory journals and paid $500 and it got published. So if you search predatory journal and Ottawa Citizen, you'll find all of his articles. They're really funny, but sad because people get caught, right? They don't either they know it's a predatory journal and pay the money to get the academic credit, or they don't even know that it's a predatory journal. So you need to be aware of the characteristics of predatory journals. And there's a list in this article by CanGIEC of how to look out for predatory journals that I think still apply, even though this was published in 2017. There used to be a list called Beale's list of predatory journals that was run by a librarian. I think his name, I forget his first name, but he actually essentially got cease and desist orders from these predatory publishers, which are large companies. And he just gave up. He said it just wasn't worth it anymore to have this list online. So unfortunately, it's not available. You'll find it archived, but it's not up to date. But just be careful about the predatory journals. If you're not sure, if it's not a well-known journal in your field, check with your supervisor and ask. Don't just submit an article to a journal that's offering to publish your work. Ignore those emails, by the way. You'll start to get more and more emails from journals that are asking you for your work. That when I first started, I thought that was pretty flattering. In fact, it's nothing. It's spam, and people fall into this trap. Tip number 7 is read the manual. I'll leave the F out. I think you know what the F stands for. Read the manual. So don't just submit a paper to a journal without reading the instruction to authors, right? There is nothing that will upset a journal editor more than getting a paper that's 1,000 words too long, or has way too many figures and texts, or is in the wrong format, or whatever it is. It'll just get bounced back to you, but it's just a waste of everybody's time and a waste of money for the journal. So read the manual of what exactly you should be doing to write the paper. It's unfortunate that many journals have totally different formats and different requirements. And so if you submit and get rejected and you have to submit to another journal, it does mean time in revising that paper. But at least you'll know what you should be revising, in what format you should be revising it. In addition, every journal has different reporting guideline requirements, and I'll talk about reporting guidelines in a second. So during writing, that was all pre-writing, right? So what is that? 7 tips out of, I think, 10 or 11 that were pre-writing. A lot of preparation beforehand. Now we're talking about writing, right? And so this is tip number 8, is sit down and actually write. So I don't know if you are aware of this quote from Jerry Seinfeld, "Don't break the chain." So after a live show, Seinfeld was stopped by a more junior comedian, right, a less successful comedian in the audience. And the comedian asked Seinfeld, "How do you do it? How is it that every time I hear you give a show, it's different jokes and you kill it, and it's like a totally different show every single time?" And what Seinfeld said is that he's got a calendar on the wall, and every single day he sits down and writes one joke. And if he writes one joke, he marks an X on the calendar. And his goal in life is, maybe it was, I don't know if he still does this, not to break the chain, right? X on every single day, and don't break the chain. So if you sit down and you have the goal of writing, 150 words or 100 words even every single day, you just sit down and write something about the paper. It may not be coherent at the end of it. It may not be perfect at the end of it. You're going to have to edit it, but you will get that paper done, right? If you sit down every day and write, you're going to get that paper done. In terms of the skill of writing, I would strongly recommend this Coursera course. It's actually from Stanford. The course is called Writing in the Sciences. It's available for free on Coursera. It is tremendously useful in learning how to use language, how to use punctuation, how to write for science, the formatting of papers and so on. It's about, I want to say 8 to 10 hours long, but worth every single minute that you take to do this. I now ask all my students to do this course as they're entering grad school, as they're starting to work on research, because I think unless you're trained to write for the sciences in some format, and we're not, right? Like, we're not really trained to do that in undergrad or med school. We wing it. And we learn by reading other people's papers and so on. But this course is super, super useful and really worth the time to do it. And then there's a BMJ writing series on writing as well by George Hall. Again, you'll get the links when I send around the slides. So in general, writing consists of writing for the sciences, right? Remember that you're not writing for English. You may have been an amazing arts writer, historical writer in undergrad. It's totally different skill to write for sciences. You're looking to use short sentences, simple words, and very clear structure. Not a lot of elaboration, not a lot of adjectives. You really want to sit down and write very, very clearly. As I mentioned, you want to identify the audience, use terminology, and avoid using jargon, right? If you're in a field, if you're writing for hem-onc, like clinicians, and you're in epidemiology, avoid using a lot of jargon or explain the words that you use if you need to. Again, like I said, don't break the chain, right? So just sit down and write. The first draft is not going to be very good. Just sit down and write, and don't interrupt your writing workflow. Obviously don't multitask, don't use social media, don't go to Netflix, but even more importantly, don't worry about references, right? Like, if you're writing the introduction and discussion, you don't need to worry about the references until afterwards. You will have to reference, obviously, but don't interrupt your flow with going to search for a reference to back up everything that you say. I think that it's important to remember that reviewers and the eventual audience may not have English as a first language. And so you need to be super, super clear to be understood by the majority of the world. Many times journals will have editorial assistants, but it costs money. So if English is not your first language, I think it's important to consider editorial assistants. I think that SickKids has that service available. I think it does cost. U of T certainly does, and journals do, but also have a second set of eyes, right? Your supervisor or a co-author might be willing to help you with editing the English if English is not your first language. Remember that a paper is a critical argument, right? You're trying to make a point. You're trying to state your research question. You're trying to review the applicable evidence, and you're trying to assess how good your study is in the context of the applicable evidence. And that means reporting your strengths and limitations and reporting what was previously present in the literature. And then what conclusions can be drawn from your research, from your presented evidence. But you got to be careful with the conclusions, right? You don't want to overstate your conclusions. You don't want to make the statements too strong. You need to be, pretty accurate, I would say, with the limitations of your study and what you can actually conclude. I think that reporting guidelines are 100% necessary when you're writing a paper. And if you're not aware of what a reporting guideline is, I'm going to give you an introduction to what it is and some of them that exist. So you may be aware of this sort of knowledge creation cycle where you do the research, you publish the research, and then you disseminate the research or knowledge translation, and then you go back and you do more research, right? So there's lots of guidance on how to do research, right? A lot of us are doing master's and PhD programs in research methodology. There's lots of guidance also on publishing the research, on what the manuscript should look like, what happens after the manuscript is submitted. That includes, the scientific writing guidance that you learn in school, instruction to authors that I told you, read the manual, and then the peer review process. The whole point of the peer review process is to make sure that this publication is accurate. So reporting guidelines kind of close the gap between doing the research and publishing the research. They make sure that your report, your paper, is transparent, complete, and very clear. And that's the purpose of the reporting guideline. And I think it's a completely necessary, important part of the whole knowledge creation cycle. So the Equator Network is really the important network to catalog and guide and teach about reporting guidelines. They have lots of training courses on how to use reporting guidelines, what's out there, and then they have a catalog of the main reporting guidelines that are out there. You can see sort of a flow diagram of deciding which reporting guideline you would use in which circumstance shown here, but I'll show you a little bit more about them in a second and which you might use. So the idea of a reporting guideline is that it's a minimum set of essential items in the form of a checklist of the items that are necessary to report. The reporting guideline is typically as general as possible and evidence-based where possible, meaning it's general, meaning it applies to the most number of studies in that group. So for example, if you're using observational research, if you're doing observational research, you're using the Strobe reporting guidelines, it's pretty general in what it requires. It should apply to most studies that are observational in nature. And it should also include items that are evidence-based, meaning we know that they're not well reported. Everybody doesn't, if everybody reports an item, you don't really need a reporting guideline of that item, right? You don't need that checklist item, but they may not be well reported, and that it actually makes the reader more clear on what's being done. And it provides the reader with critical information on assessing reliability of a study. So some examples of reporting guidelines. Strobe, as I mentioned, is for observational studies, but because reporting guidelines are very general, meaning they apply to the majority of studies in that field, there are extensions to the general reporting guidelines that are for more specific fields. So for example, people who do genetic association studies found that Strobe really didn't include checklist items for things that were very specific to genetic association studies, but were important. So Strega was produced for observational research that are genetic association studies. Lots of other extensions to Strobe. I was involved in the creation of Record, which is for studies using routinely collected health data, like health administrative data, like what we do at ICES. That's the reporting guideline that you would use if you did health administrative data research or EHR research, and so on. Similarly, Consort, most people are probably aware of that if you're at all involved in RCTs. Consort are the first reporting guidelines that was widely accepted for RCTs. And then there have been extensions for cluster trials, non-inferiority trials, and so on. And then START is for diagnostic tests, and PRISMA is for systematic review. There are many other reporting guidelines out there. Again, look at the Equator Network website. They have the the main reporting guidelines right there on the front page, and you can just click on the extensions to find out what else might apply to your group, your reporting, your paper rather. But I think this is also useful, this goodreports.org that was produced by Equator Network. And this is sort of for you as an author, walking you through which one you should use. So it asks, what type of study are you writing? It's a drop-down menu. You click on it, it brings you to the reporting guideline, and it walks you through each item in the reporting guideline and says, okay, where did you report this? What page number and so on? And then you fill it out. And at the end, it provides you with a PDF or a Word document that you can upload to the journal website if they're asking you for the reporting guideline. And so I think that's very, very useful. It's a nice quick way of getting your reporting guideline in. Even if a journal doesn't request a reporting guideline, I usually submit it because I find that it's helpful for peer reviewers, right? So a peer reviewer will look for certain items. And if you say, all right, here's my reporting guideline, this is where I reported each of these items, it's less work for the peer reviewer and they're more likely to be happy with you, I think. So sections of a manuscript: title, state the key message of your art paper, state the research question, and describe the study. Any of those are acceptable for the title. I think there's no specific, don't make it a question. You have a hypothesis at the beginning, but the title should not be your hypothesis. The title should be what you found or what your study design was or so on. The introduction is typically 2 to 3 paragraphs. It's not a systematic review of the literature. It's a series of points from the very general overview of your field to maybe 1 paragraph or a half paragraph looking at why your study is important, and then ending with what's your research question? What is your aim? Why did you do this study? So your methods, obviously, there's lots to report in the methods, and I think that really depends on what type of study you're doing, the methodology, and so on. And so I'll just leave that to say, look at the reporting guidelines that are relevant for your type of research, and that will tell you what to report in the methods. Similarly, the results depends on the methodology, so look at the reporting guidelines. But in general, you start off with kind of your population description. Who did you include? What did you include as the first paragraph? The analyses that you did and the results of the analyses, and which ones support your main message right at the front. Secondary analyses can go at the bottom, but if you say this was my aim, that should be your first result reported. And then explain your figures and tables in more detail in your results, but don't duplicate, don't state again your results, right? If you've got these results in figures and tables, you don't need to say in the text, these are my results again. You can just clarify or highlight 1 or 2 key points from each table or figure. And then discussion, this is probably, I think, the most important section of your manuscript, because this is what the reviewer is going to care about. It's you boiling down your results into a main message. So the paragraph 1 is always the same. What did you do? What did you find? Your main conclusions, and why is your study unique? That's what you need in paragraph 1. And then last paragraph restates paragraph 1. You have to reword it, obviously. You can't just say the same thing again, but really it's the same thing, right? It's we found this, in this study, we found this. So paragraph 1 and last paragraph taken care of. Then in between, you want to discuss your results in order, from most important to maybe least important, and why they're novel, why are they important, and how do they agree or disagree with the existing literature. So this is where you need a little bit of a literature review to know what's out there on your field and how is your study consistent or not consistent. And if it's not consistent, you probably want to explain why it's not consistent, right? Why is your study better? Why did you find something different? Why did you do a better job? And that's where you'll kind of want to teach the audience about the topic. And then the second to last paragraph, sometimes it's 2 paragraphs, are your strengths and limitations. So don't forget about your strengths, right? So people often just launch into the limitations because they're self-effacing, I guess, right? They don't want to toot their own horn. But I think it's important to say what your strengths are, what the study's strengths are. Like, what did you do that was different? Why should people care? And then go into your limitations. But for each limitation, almost always, for each limitation, you should be mitigating that limitation, right? Like, why, yes, you have this limitation, but why should the reader still believe your overall conclusions, right? Why is it okay that you had this limitation? And sometimes you can say, this is just the study design. We did an observational study. We didn't do an RCT. So there's the risk of bias and confounding, right? That's fine. but it still needs to be believable. So you need to be careful not to overstate your limitations to the point where people just don't believe your results anymore. Tables and figures. Table 1 should always be, at least in clinical research, basic science might be different, I'm not sure, but table 1 should always describe your sample, your cohort, your sample, or your main comparison groups, right? That should be your table 1. And then other tables and figures should show your most important data in support of the paper's key messages. You know, if it's not your most important data, you can always reserve it for supplemental online tables and figures, right? There's now no limitations for what you can put online. So if there's secondary analyses, if they're not as important, if, you know, whatever sort of supplemental, I prefer more be included. You shouldn't leave them out, but it can be online supplementals. And then remember that the captions of tables and figures should be completely self-contained. So, you know, a reader should be able to flip to a table and know exactly what you did, right? They shouldn't have to read the text or the methods or anything like that. They should really be self-contained and very, very clear. And again, don't forget to use a reference manager software. I'm amazed at how many kind of senior residents or fellows aren't aware that these reference manager software exist. They really, so what they are is they collect all your references in a single file, a single place, and then they integrate into Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever you're using to write, so that all you have to do is click a button and it links back to the reference and puts the reference in your reference list. And if you later delete that sentence and delete the reference, it'll reorder all your references automatically. It's almost impossible to write a paper nowadays without reference manager software, because you just can't, I mean, there's too many references, right? You're cutting and pasting all the time. And the other advantage of reference manager software is a lot of them have different journal formats built in. So if you get rejected by one journal, you just go off and reformat the paper, obviously, but then you just click a button and it'll reformat all the references for the new journal. So this is sort of what it looks like when I'm writing a paper, recent paper that I've written. And you can see that EndNote, I use EndNote, is integrated in Microsoft Word. And there's a drop-down menu for the different styles that are available. These are the ones that I used most recently. You can select another style. There's many different styles. And in fact, if you go to the EndNote website, you can see that there are 7,340 different journal styles that you can download from the website. So you can, you know, if it's not in the software, if it didn't come with the software, you go to the website and you search your journal, it might be there already. So that was writing long enough, I think. Now, after writing, what happens? So I think first thing tip is sort of value your co-authors. Give them time, send them the paper, and take their feedback graciously. Take into account their feedback. They're there to help you. They're a co-author. They want the paper to be accepted, right? So they're not giving you feedback just to be mean. They really want the paper to be accepted and to get credit for it. And they probably know their stuff. If you're including them as co-investigators, they likely know what they're doing. So please take their feedback graciously. Make revisions after you take their feedback. Now, one thing that might be a bit controversial is I think you need to set timelines, right? Unfortunately, we all have stories of the senior investigator, senior co-author, where the manuscript sits, now would be figuratively, sits on his or her desk for months and never sent back to the junior, the student. And I've heard years, right? Like I've heard some students who went 5 years and just could not get their supervisor to send that manuscript back to them. That's not acceptable. It's completely unacceptable and it's very disrespectful. So I kind of try to avoid all of that. Even when I was a junior investigator, it's harder if you're a student and this is your primary supervisor. If that's the case, something's wrong and you should probably speak to the university to help advocate for you. But if they're a co-author, even if you're a junior investigator, what I typically do is that when I send out the email saying, please review this paper, we're going to submit it to this journal. I want to submit by this date. Can you please provide a review by this date? So that gives me time enough to review. So you're setting a goal and a timeline to get that review back. You know, you have to be respectful. Do not expect a co-author to review a paper in 4 days. That's not going to happen, right? The minimum I would recommend if it's a real full paper is at least 3 weeks for co-authors to review the manuscript, at least, right? And then, you know, you can always say to somebody, if you find this timeline, you know, unrealistic, please just let me know and we can talk about it. But I think what the deadline does is it gives the co-authors a goal of getting it done, and typically they do get it done. If they don't, at some point you're going to have to decide, are they still a co-author or not? And right, that's when I send a reminder email if they're a week late. And beyond that, I send an email saying, listen, we're submitting now. If you don't find this paper acceptable, we'll take your name off. I'm really sorry. But they need to read over the manuscript and they need to approve it. And that's sort of the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors guidelines. If they don't agree to the publication and the contents of the manuscript, they cannot be co-authors. So at some point, you just have to say, enough, I can't do this anymore. And you may rely on your supervisor or the senior investigator to do that dirty work for you, right? I think it's hard when it comes from a student, and it may come off as arrogant. So, if I'm your supervisor or I'm the senior author, it's my responsibility to get the co-authors in line as well. But I think you can send deadlines, right? I think it's helpful to most co-authors to have a deadline from the first author. Then you submit to the journal. Make sure it's proofread, and again, the language is edited, especially if English is not your first language. But even if English is your first language, it's amazing how many typos get through, or sentences aren't quite right, or they're awkward or whatever. Have somebody proofread it for you if you're not able to proofread your own. Cover letter is super, super important, right? So the cover letter is what tells the editors why your paper should be published in that journal. The cover letter, and I'm trying to remember, I don't think I have a slide on the cover letter, I might, but the cover letter explains what you've done and why it's important. Often I will state this paper has not been submitted to any other journal while under consideration here. I might suggest peer reviewers if the journal website doesn't allow you to suggest peer reviewers. But I think what's most important is, why is your paper important and why should it be published in that particular journal? Be patient. This is probably out of date. I think this 1 to 2 months is pre-COVID. There has been a lot of delays in peer review with COVID for whatever reason. I think partly because of competing priorities, a lot of clinicians being called to do more clinical work and so on. It's become, as an editor, I'm an editor at 2 journals, it's very, very, very hard to find peer reviewers now. Most journals, once you assign a peer reviewer, most journals will give a deadline of between 2 and 4 weeks for the peer reviewer to read it and provide their feedback. But that 2 to 4 weeks doesn't include the time required to find a peer reviewer by the editor, and the time required at the end for the editor to process what the peer reviewer said and make a decision whether it was accept, reject, or anything in between. So 1 to 2 months is probably a bit low these days. I would say look at 2 to 4 months, unfortunately, for a peer review in many, many journals. And have a tough skin, right? Like, in the end, peer reviewers are there to criticize your paper. That's what they're there to do. They're also there to make your paper better. If they find that it's an important paper and that it deserves publication in that journal, they're there to make it better and acceptable to the journal readership. You'll often get, there's a series of different types of accepting or rejection. So there's outright rejection, and the journal editor will say, sorry, not acceptable for publication, don't send it again, basically. And then you're done, right? Like, there's very little room for appeal there. For the most part, even if the peer reviewers are out to lunch, just move on. Like, it's very rare that an appeal to a journal will work in that circumstance. There will be major revisions, so that's the majority of papers. The majority of papers on the first shot, the peer reviewers will say, this paper needs major revisions, please make it better. That's not a rejection, right? Like, if you get a major revision from a high impact journal, that is like the best thing ever. You will not get an accept as is from most journals. So a major revision is good news. It means you can make the paper better. And in most cases, I would say, a major revision and resubmission, it ends up getting accepted at the end. It might be a few revisions after that, but it ends up getting accepted in most cases. There's minor revisions, which are typically like little typos in grammar. Very rare that you'll ever have a paper on the first go accepted with minor revisions. And then there's accept as is, which I don't think I've ever had a paper accepted as is with no revisions, unless it was an invited editorial or something like that. So, the vast majority of papers of mine that were accepted got major revisions on the first time. So don't feel bad about that. Expect that there's going to be a lot of comments from the peer reviewers. develop a tough skin, don't take it personally, and then respond. And we'll talk about that in a second. So if it's rejected, try again somewhere else, right? This is something that, I don't know, somebody taught me very early in my career. Every manuscript has a home. Doesn't matter where that home is. You've done the work. Yes, there's circumstances that you might feel the manuscript is not good enough for publication. And if you feel that, take it back and revise it and do something else, right? But even a low impact journal is an okay publication. I think that even a case report, I think when I was a fellow, I had a case report that probably was rejected 5 or 6 times and ended up finding a home in a general pediatrics journal. Was, it is what it is, right? And then it got cited probably 20, 25 times. So every journal has a home. Don't get discouraged if you're rejected repeatedly, just keep at it. But do revise your paper based on previous peer reviews, right? Even if your paper gets rejected at journal 1 and you submit to journal 2, you might get the same reviewers, right? And if you haven't revised your paper and addressed their comments, that reviewer is going to reject it again. So just do your best to revise the paper and, try to show gratitude, right? Like if you get a revise and resubmit, say thank you, be kind, don't be personally offended. There's nothing personal here. You just need to kind of focus on what you can do to make the paper better and move forward. Response letters, if you don't get rejected. So I talked about this, right? The kind of 4 major categories. How to craft a response letter, be nice, write in a collegial tone, right? Don't be aggressive, don't be defensive. Again, it's not personal. This is the peer reviewer's job, is to criticize your paper. You're gonna get jerk reviewers, and I could have used a harsher word there, but I won't. It's being recorded. But you're gonna get reviewers who are just not nice and make some dumb comment that makes you feel completely demeaned and completely not worthwhile. Just ignore those comments. It's not worthwhile. If possible, just ignore those reviewers, right? If the comments are out of left field, address your review, your response to those comments. Pretend you're responding to the editor, because trust me, the editors know if a reviewer is being a jerk, the editors are aware of that reviewer being a jerk, right? They've read that review too, and they know that it's not appropriate. And oftentimes, as an editor, if I get a review like that, I'll send it back to the peer reviewer and say, well, would you mind please, rewording your comments to be a little less aggressive, a little less attacking. But anyway, just try to keep collegial, try to create a positive, engaging atmosphere in your letter. Go point by point. Each of the reviewer's comments and suggestions, address them point by point. You may not be able to fix your manuscript to address every comment, in which case you should tell them why you couldn't address it, why it's not possible to address it, or why you shouldn't address it, right? You may feel that methodologically you should not address that comment. Tell them why, and tell them why your results are still valid, even though you can't address their comment, and their comment may be valid, but tell them why your results are still valid. And then really with the point by point, please tell them where you address those comments in the manuscript, in the revised manuscript. Try to provide page numbers or line numbers of every revision of where you put that in your manuscript. And every journal is going to make you submit a version that's clean and a version with track changes. So submit both at the same time. And that's it. I don't know how many points, how many tips was that? That was 12 tips, not 10. So yeah, you saw that a good number of those tips were pre-writing. And I think that's really the most important point here is, right, that you need to set up pre-writing in order to be successful in writing. So with that, I can take some questions.